Compare the ways poets present soldiers in The Charge of the Light Brigade and one other poem from the Power and Conflict cluster. The first thing that you need to do with a question like this is identify another poem which contains soldiers. And this would be a lovely question because it narrows the field somewhat. There are obvious examples. Exposure, World War I poem about soldiers. Remains, a more modern poem in outlook, but it's about soldiers and the effects of war on those soldiers. Bayonet Charge, there's a soldier in the poem, and therefore it's going to offer you opportunities. Kamikaze actually is about a soldier. The poem may not necessarily focus on war per se, it seems to prioritise that of the family, but and the effects of the family of the pilot's decision, but it offers you an opportunity because he is a soldier in the unconventional sense. He is a soldier who has shirked his duty, at least that's what society appears to think, and his subsequent ostracisation is ultimately what drives the poem. It's why it's been written. All of those are great choices. You wouldn't choose Ozymandias, would you? You're not going to choose London. Don't feel that you're being clever by choosing an obscure poem. Choose something fairly straightforward. Make your life easy. Remember that the other thing that you're trying to do is prioritise The Charge of the Light Brigade. Why are you going to do that? Well, The Charge of the Light Brigade will be printed in front of you in the exam. There is no requirement for you to spend 50% of your time on a poem that isn't printed. As long as there are 2 poems there, you can get yourself some really good marks. A good balance is something like 65% on the poem that's printed, 35%, 30% on the poem that isn't. Don't make your life more difficult. Choose an appropriate poem, say something interesting about it. The Charge of the Light Brigade. I'll compare it to Exposure. Why? Similar eras, a similar type of experience of war. Let's get cracking. In The Charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson demonstrates how soldiers are phenomenally brave, a fact which he seeks to celebrate throughout the poem. However, the poem also looks at the decisions of high-ranking soldiers and aims to subtly critique those people. And it must be a subtle critique, for Tennyson is the poet laureate, the national poet of the day. And so to explicitly criticise other members of the establishment might not necessarily do him much good. By contrast, Exposure by William Owen is shaped by Owen's own experiences of trench warfare. As a soldier who is experiencing conflict at the time when the poem is being written, the brutality of conflict, the brutality of nature is explicitly clear. But more significantly, we can see how it is nature that is the real enemy of the soldier. In Charge of the Light Brigade, we are supposed to see the phenomenal and heroic bravery of the soldiers throughout the text. Perhaps the most significant stanza, however, is that of the 4th stanza. Significant because it is the longest stanza, depicting the length of the bloody battle itself. And it's the stanza where we can see just how violent they had to be, just how violent the conflict was. Tennyson's repetition of the violent verb flashed demonstrates the speed of their actions, the speed of the soldiers' movements. The horrific violence is made demonstrably clear in a verb such as sabring, a sabre being a large sword. It also reveals the contextual issue of the soldiers going into a conflict where they are literally outgunned. Taking a sword to a gunfight is something of a cliche these days, but this is literally what has happened in this text. The soldiers have plunged into the battery smoke, demonstrating a casual disregard for their own life. And that's why Tennyson asks us to honour the charge they made, to honour the Light Brigade, Noble 600. For these men have martyred themselves for a cause much bigger than themselves. It is almost beyond our comprehension that other people would do such things, such heroic actions. By contrast and exposure, Owen's frustration seems to stem very much from the absence of heroism. It was heroism that was sold to many soldiers in World War I. Propaganda messages were used to demonstrate that your country needs you, but their country doesn't need them, because Owen's poem depicts a time of inactivity, of nothingness. And indeed, one of the bitter ironies of the text and of the poem is that Owen died of hypothermia. Well, he died just before the end of the war. The poem begins, "Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us." And as a first line of the poem, it's so incredibly powerful because it demonstrates why do their brains ache? They ache because of maybe a literal headache, because of the kind of continuous sounds of conflict, but more interestingly, perhaps because of some kind of existential crisis. Why are they there? Who took them there? Why did they decide to do this? Are they going to live or die? What's the point? And the first line also reinforces that if they do die, it's not going to be as a consequence of the conflict. We're told that the merciless iced east winds knifed them. The east winds, which are coming from Poland, from Russia, from the cold east. Perhaps a metaphor for what would eventually be the far-reaching conflict. But to be knifed is to be stabbed, and demonstrates the violence of their suffering. What I'm doing here, if I pause there with an analysis of the poetry, is I'm trying to make my writing sound as discursive, as much like discussion as possible, which is very easy to do when you're actually talking. But for you, the key is to say something interesting. Prioritise the parts of the poems that you know, the parts that you think are interesting. So, for instance, with the Charge of the Light Brigade, I went straight to the fourth stanza. I said something about its structure being longer. There are things I missed. I could have said stuff about the broken rhythm of the text. How previously to that point we've had dactylic dimeter, diddy-dum, 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 and in the fourth stanza it's broken. You can't do everything. I'm not going to beat myself up about it. But what I did instead was focus on those verbs: flashed, sabering. I didn't mention charging, but plunged. And you focus on the parts of the text that give you a chance to say what you think is interesting. Similarly, with exposure, I prioritise the beginning of the text because the first line of the text is so powerful. Is the first line of Charge of the Light Brigade powerful? Well, it's not without merit. Does it have the same impact as the fourth stanza? I don't think so. Am I therefore going to start with the first line of the Charge of the Light Brigade? No, I'm not. Say what you think is interesting. Be interesting. Say what you think. That's the best way to get yourself some good marks. Good luck.